The Portfolio Composer, episode 222.
You're listening to the Portfolio Composer podcast with your host and coach, Garrett Hope, where he teaches you what it takes to master the business end of writing music through mindset, marketing, and business skills. Make sure to sign up for the newsletter at theportfoliocomposer.com for exclusive offers, business insights, and information not shared on the podcast. And now, for this episode of the Portfolio Composer.
I've been trying in the past couple of years to try to have a little mantra for myself, which is pay more for better, and to try to encourage myself to spend a little bit more for something that in the long run either will last longer or is just that bit better, and that where I can see that the short-term cost saving is causing a long-term problem. So when it comes to things like recycled paper and greener versions of products, I'm keen at least to encourage people to try out, even just like one time. I'll buy one instance of this greener tape to see if I like it, to see if it feels any different.
This episode is brought to you by Dorico, the music notation software from Steinberg. Just released, Dorico Pro 3 is a major new version with game-changing advances in note input, notation, and engraving. Also available from Steinberg is Dorico Elements, an entry-level application that packs all of the essential power of Dorico Pro into a simple, streamlined package that is ideal for those getting started. Find out more later in the show. Hello, and welcome to episode 222 of the Portfolio Composer podcast. I am your host, your coach, and your teacher, Garrett Hope. Today's guest is Lillie Harris. Lillie is a British composer who studied at the RCM with Harris Kitos. Her interest in composition grew out of learning instruments, a flair for languages, and a love of creative writing. She has participated in various schemes for young composers, including with the RSNO, LPO, LSO, and currently the NYCGB. Apart from composing, she is a copyist primarily for film, TV, and game music recording sessions, and writes the user manual for the music notation software Dorico. I had such a great time speaking with Lillie for the podcast. She is a wonderful, bright spirit, and I learned so much, actually, about good engraving habits that I've been practicing in my music as I've been setting scores and creating parts. I think you will get a lot out of this, too. I hope you enjoy. Hi, Lillie. Welcome to the Portfolio Composer.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, the pleasure's mine. I first heard about you. Somehow I came across your blog, The Green Copyist, last year, and I've kind of been watching from the sidelines, and then I saw that you're now working for Dorico and all this exciting stuff that you're doing, and as a composer, you seem to be doing really cool things, and I thought, it's time. I'm going to reach out to Lillie and see if she'd be available. So here we are.
Here we are.
Yeah. Why don't we just start by talking about kind of what's in your portfolio of income-producing activities as a creative?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag, and I've been reflecting on it quite a lot recently because I think I had to apply for something. One of the questions was like, or along the lines of, would you want to be a full-time composer, or how do you see your career progressing or changing? And so at the moment, I'm 3 years out of studies at the Royal College of Music. My main job is that I write the user manual for Dorico, the new notation software from Steinberg, which I've been doing for almost exactly 2 years. My first day was the 3rd of July, 2017, that's a decent chunk of my time, but oh my God, it's a very cool job to have, and I get an awful lot out of it, and I hope I put an awful lot into it. So that's my main income source, and also social source. And then I also do sort of copying work and bits of engraving for mostly film music recording sessions, but also TV and games. And obviously there's the composing, but in terms of financial income, the composing is the smaller side of the spectrum.
That's all right. It can change.
That would be nice.
It'll grow. Yeah. The whole idea behind what you do as a copyist and thinking through that from a green perspective is what really caught my attention. And you have a whole blog called The Green Copyist. Tell me more about that. What was the genesis of that?
Well, I'm pretty sure it sort of came about through a conversation with a friend of mine called Chris Parker. He's a sound engineer, audio engineer, who now actually works at Abbey Road Studios. He's a very, very cool guy. And we were talking about something, and I think I responded to a tweet of his, or we were having a conversation, and I just did hashtag Green Copyist, or he did, and then he went, that's like a blog, that's a thing, that should be a thing, you need to make that a thing. And I was like, well, it's going to be a thing, and now it's a thing. It was just like that.
Just like that. And what are you exploring in this blog?
Well, it's something that I definitely want to expand and do more of, and pay more attention to when I can, because sort of the environment has always been an important part of my life for almost as long as I can remember. Really, we had sort of small gardens when I was growing up. We had lived in a little terraced house, but we had front and back. And in the front, we had some ponds. And my goodness, did I love that pond. It was full of frogs and newts. And I just spend hours in the summer just sitting out there listening to the frogs croaking away and watching, the frog spawn turn into tadpoles and froglets, and just enjoying the whole life cycles that water kind of brings into being, particularly in a street where most of the other houses just had lawn at the front, and there was our garden with trees and a compost heap and the pond and the swing, and so it was just a wonderful place to be. And when I was at school, I was briefly in charge of a small group of students. And it was called World Aims, which stands for Action in Methodist Schools. And as part of that group, I was supposed to lead an action once a term that either raised money or awareness, or did something in the school about a social issue, an environmental issue. And one of the ones we did, I arranged a Mexican squat. So I got, as many people as had come to the Central Quad in one of the break times. We did a Mexican wave around the quad, except it wasn't a wave, it was a squat, to raise awareness for the fact that, not enough people in the world have access to a clean toilet, which has all sorts of ramifications, but one of them mainly, for young girls going to school, if their school doesn't have proper sanitary equipment and they have their natural menstrual happening, it makes it that much harder for them to be in school. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the things we did. But one of the other things I tried to do at school, and I never managed to get off the ground, was I wanted a ceremonial tree planting every year to commemorate the leavers who were graduating, as it is, at the end of their time at the school, to have a tree planted. It would be a commemorative tree. This was our tree, class of 2013 or whatever. Here we go. And it would grow, and we'd grow an orchard. And my plan was that it could be a fruit tree, and the class could pick the fruit tree, but the fruit tree would eventually bear fruit that could go then back into the kitchens. We managed to get a holly tree in the end, but it was something that was on my radar and I wanted to do.
Not a fruit tree.
It wasn't in the end, and oh God, if I could go back. I just love fruit trees, they're fantastic. So environmental things have always been on my mind, and when I was starting to do the copying work more and getting more into it and doing more of it, I started to become more intimate with the amount of paper that goes into it, particularly for the recording sessions, because the process is so condensed, because you've got often a couple of days of preparation, and then you dump all of this paper at the studio, go, here you go, and you look at it, and sometimes I carry it, a lot of the time I carry it, and you can feel the weight of it, and you're like, this is a lot of paper for one day for this one project. And I was like, right, okay, I need to do something about this. Can this be recycled? Well, I mean, recycle the paper afterwards, but where's the paper coming from? What can I do as a small person who's just one cog in a machine? Mm-hmm. What can I do that will make this slightly better? And lo and behold, I found some recycled paper, and I was like, I'm going to give that a go. And it was lovely. So it's from there. So I've been convinced that there's some fantastic recycled paper out there. The process of recycling paper is phenomenally much, much better for the environment in many different ways than making virgin paper. And so here we go.
Wow. I'm imagining that on a really big film or game project in the studio, you could go through reams of paper in a session.
Absolutely reams. So the project that sort of started it last year was Our Planet for Netflix, with the composer Steve Price, who just is a lovely, lovely composer, lovely man, brilliant composer. who has a fabulous team around him, just really great people to work with. And they wanted it to be a streamlined process and sort of budget efficient. And so I found this paper for them, and it was sort of a little bit cheaper than some other stuff I was looking at, because I'm relatively small scale as a copyist. I don't have an awful lot of space to stockpile, so I can't buy in huge bulk. So I'm relatively limited in what I can and can't get hold of. And I thought I'll give it a go on this session. Why not? And for each episode, and there were 8 episodes, possibly 2,000.
2,000 for each
Yes.
episode?
It's about that. It was definitely more than 1,000. Up to around 2,000 for the parts. Because it's a little bit hard to keep track of, because obviously your reams are coming and going. But generally it was about that. I think I calculated in total, was it over 7,000 separate individual parts across the entire series.
Oh my word. Okay, so this has real world implications, because paper is expensive, and recycled paper tends to be more expensive than, as you said, virgin paper. So we're often on a budget. How do we deal with that?
Well, it can be more expensive. There's a brand that I found which is called Evolution, and that can be fractionally, a little bit cheaper than similar weighted paper. It's 100 GSM, which is a little on the light side for session recording, but it works. It just about works. So it doesn't necessarily need to be that much more expensive, but I mean, compared to the sort of bog standard print paper that you'd buy, this sort of stuff is definitely more expensive than that. And so if you're a composer who doesn't do an awful lot of their own physical music preparation, it might initially seem a bit off-putting, I think.
And it's a good color too, not just the weight, but it's a good color.
I think it's lovely. If you were to pick up a piece of this Evolution recycled paper and look at it, there's a chance you might notice it's like a fraction off-white. And you'd probably only really notice if you held it next to a virgin sheet of paper, which I have done many times and tried to take photos of it. But I mean, I didn't label the photos at the time, and now I look at the photos and I can't actually see the difference, which is fantastic. Excellent organisation on my part. So it is a fraction grayer than virgin paper. But in some senses, that's beneficial. If you're printing music, which is generally black markings on the white background, you're unlikely to run into any problems. If you were printing something that had a lot of very subtle colour, sort of greyish variation, you might lose some of the definition. But I've not tried that, so I can't say for sure. I just remember reading a review of that online, someone who sort of had that perception. But I think what's nice about the fact that it's slightly off-white is that glare is reduced. And particularly, I tend to print on the rougher side, because it tends to come with one slightly smoother side, one slightly rougher side. And I tend to print on the rougher side, because then that will reduce the amount of light getting reflected off the paper on the stand. And it also, pencil markings tend to come through much easier on slightly rougher paper than shiny, because you know how shiny paper can just sort of glide off.
Yeah, interesting. I think that might only be available in Great Britain, because I can find a website for it that it's all in like A4 and standard British sizes.
Yeah.
I can't find it on Amazon. That's interesting.
Possibly not, because obviously, yes, in America you have different paper sizes.
Yeah.
I tracked down the actual pulp, make the actual... what is the word? The factory that actually... It's not factory. Paper mill. Paper mill is the word I'm looking for. Yeah. I tracked down the paper mill that actually produces that paper, and they sort of sell it under various different names, which makes it really hard to find. The paper mill I tracked down is it's based in Austria, so it is based in Europe. And there's another paper mill that's also... Is there one based in the UK? So quite a lot of the ones that I found at the moment that actually do the sort of repulping of the post-consumer waste paper back into a papery product of recycled origin. They're probably quite a lot based in the UK, but I imagine it's something that will only expand, particularly if a lot of interest is shown around the world. I just want to go back for a second to your point about the cost thing, because it is actually quite an important one. And it's something that I realised that I can sort of say from a slight position of privilege, and that thanks to my salaried job, I have a little bit more financial security than I did a number of years ago, which I most certainly did not fresh out of college. But it's that from an environmental perspective, I've been trying in the past couple of years to try to have a little mantra for myself, which is pay more for better, and to try to encourage myself to spend a little bit more for something that in the long run either will last longer or is just that bit better, and that where I can see that the short-term cost saving is causing a long-term problem. So one of the things that we've done at home is we switched from buying milk in plastic bottles to going back to the sort of reusable glass milk bottle delivery on electric milk floats that, you know, we use, give back, they get washed, they get refilled, they get brought back. Because obviously milk in supermarkets that come in plastic bottles are often a loss leader. The supermarket charges you less than it costs to buy the milk to get you into the shop to buy other things. And they sell it to you in plastic cartons that you use once and then recycle. But there's no guarantee that it's actually recycled, which we are now learning. The recycled material might be shipped around the world and dumped somewhere.
Yes.
Yay! So
yeah, it's a real problem.
So it's cheaper in the short term for me to buy milk in plastic packaging. But because I'm able to, I'm telling myself, well, I should invest and spend a bit more on something that's better, environmentally better for the farmers, I'm sure, better for a company that's trying to do something that's more sustainable. So when it comes to things like recycled paper and greener versions of products, I'm keen at least to encourage people to try out, even just like one time. It's like, I'll buy one instance of this greener tape to see if I like it, to see if it feels any different, and to weigh up for yourself whether you like it, whether it's worth the cost, whether or not. Because I think even if you try a greener product that's maybe slightly more expensive and you go, you know what, I don't think it's going to make that much of a difference for me. The cost isn't worth it. I tried it, but no, at least then you've tried it.
Yeah. I love that philosophy. I wish more people had that, especially when it came to buying music.
Yes, which, yeah, we could all be better at, myself included.
I think the issue of paper and copying is always an interesting thing to me. I tried to get into copying when I was in college, and I had a few freelance gigs doing some engraving work and whatever. And quickly occurred to me that this is a pretty deep and complex field. It's more than just putting the notes on the staff and sizing things correctly. The paper itself is actually important because that affects the performer's experience and the aesthetic quality of looking at the music.
Yep.
So as a professional copyist and engraver, what are some of the things that composers can do that's just real low-hanging fruit that will increase the readability and performability of their music?
As in sort of preparing the music themselves?
Yeah, and paper quality. I mean, that's so wide open. Anything.
Yeah. So say you're a composer and you're having something performed or you're having something recorded, either can't or would rather not get someone else to handle all the music preparation for you. So you're doing it all yourself. The first thing is the paper. There are all sorts of things to consider. And some of the things I literally learned the other week because we had a visit to Oxford University Press. We met someone in their production department who was really happy to talk about paper. And I was very, very happy to encourage her to talk about paper. And everyone else in the group was sat there going, what? And I was like, tell me more about the grammage. So she was saying that the amount of wood chips or wood pulp in the mix of the paper will affect how noisy it is. So the less wood, the less sort of barky bits, but the quieter the paper is. So that's something that you might not get immediately into if this isn't your full-time thing, but it's something to be aware of. And if you are able to feel paper in person, if you're able to go into a shop and try stuff, which obviously these days is quite hard because you're relying on online stationery suppliers a lot of the time, and even in a shop, it's probably packaged in a way you can't touch it. But if you can touch the paper, some of the things you might want to be thinking about is the weight. Yes, I think most copyists would say absolute minimum 100 GSM, quite a lot even for parts like 120 GSM, and that does feel quite luxurious. For me personally, partly because it's that much easier to find paper that's 100 GSM than 120 GSM, because it's sort of the further up you go, the slightly more niche it gets, the more expensive it gets, obviously, and the slightly trickier it is to find. I tend to say that 100 GSM is acceptable, particularly for like recording sessions where it's only going to be used once or twice. But if it's going to if it's going to be rehearsed and taken to different venues across a couple of weeks, I'd probably recommend going up a little bit heavier to 120 GSM, just because it just doesn't tear as easily. It's just that bit sturdier. It has that thinginess. It's more solid.
Can I interrupt you for just 1 second?
Yes, of course.
Because I want to make a conversion here for American audiences. So GSM is talking about the amount of pressure it's taken to make the paper. That is both the thinness, that's the weight, is kind of how flexible it is. And standard American copier paper is 20 pound. And I just looked up a conversion chart.
Right.
100 GSM is about 68 pounds. So that's 3 times.
Wait, standard copy of paper is 20 pounds?
Yes.
Compared to 68 for 100 GSM. My goodness. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. Well, unless this website's totally wrong, but
no,
then it's like 3 times thicker.
Oh, okay. Well, because standard copy of paper in the UK is about 80 GSM. I think.
Is it really?
I think.
80 GSM is converted here to 54 pounds, which is roughly twice as thick as standard copier paper.
Oh, okay. We learn something every day.
Yeah, you can experience this if you buy a legitimate score or part from like a major publisher. Then the scores are thick.
Yeah.
And the parts are heavy so they don't curl up or blow off the stand. And we print all these things, as self-published composers on what we buy, 20-pound paper at the store.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. The parts that you published music is sturdy, because if you think about it, a lot of the time, if it's going, particularly for sort of, the wider audiences, if you think sort of amateur orchestras or school orchestras or things like that, that part is going to be given to them at the first rehearsal. They'll probably take it home at least once or twice. They'll rehearse it at home. They'll put it in their school bag, or they'll put it in their rucksack with other things, and it'll come to and fro various places multiple times. And then it will be on the stand, or it might be bundled up with other things. It's going to be manhandled by multiple people, some of whom don't necessarily treat it like their firstborn child, like weirdos do, me. So it needs to be able to take a bit of here and there wear and tear. Yeah, so weight is make sure you get something that's a little bit heavier, particularly if it's going to move around. But then if you do want to get a bit more niche, that tip from the Oxford University Press production person is, have a little think about the sound of it. And you can do that by sort of flicking the paper over and just having a listen.
So listening to the paper itself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in rehearsal context and for sort of personal use, it's not that much of a big deal. But if you're talking in a recording studio, particularly if it's got tight page turns, which sometimes they do because people love them strings. Yes, nice long string parts with lots of semiquavers where you like them. If they need to flick that paper over, you might catch that on the recording. So obviously the quieter the paper and also the heavier, the less noise it makes.
Okay, that's logical. Makes sense.
Makes sense.
This episode is sponsored by Dorico, the future of scoring. And we want to feature real Dorico users so you can know that real composers out in the world today are using Dorico to make their careers happen.
My name is Rode Gustafsson, and I am a publisher with my company Recapo Edition. I was one of the first to buy Dorico. I was watching the release on YouTube, and I think it was within a couple of hours I bought Dorico. I have no regrets whatsoever. I bought it and I never looked back. It's my dream program. I am really a fan of the engrave mode and with the master pages and how the philosophy of music frames and text frames, that you can combine both music and text on the setup that you want. And that's a very important feature for me as a publisher. My workflow has improved a lot. And it sounds nerdy, but it's a joy to work in the program. As soon as you open the program, you say, yes, now I want to create some good music. I think it's a big competitor. There are some features that is not included yet, but I can work 100% of my time in Dorico. And if there is something that I need to do that Dorico doesn't have, I can always do it graphically. I just have to give my congratulations to the team. I am a part of the Facebook group. The Dorico has its own group. The community around it, it's such full of love. And if I have any question, or if the community has any, you just go to Facebook and write, "Hi, can you do this?" Or I can't really find this feature, and almost immediately someone is writing back an answer. I would absolutely recommend Dorico to everybody. I already do that to my colleagues and fellow musicians, and to those who are not sure whether they are the right fits for Dorico, I always say, try to download. It's free for 1 month. Just go ahead, write in some music, and I'm convinced that you won't regret it. It will improve the quality of your music, especially if you're a composer. The output, the raw output, when you just put in the music without editing, it looks beautiful right from the start.
The kind folks at Dorico have set up a special web page so you can go and download a free 30-day trial copy of Dorico. So go and do that. I have been using the program and I'm absolutely in love with it. Go to dorico.com/TPC. So we have weight, we have sound, anything else?
Binding, please don't use sellotape. Just don't. Love yourself. Don't do it.
What should we use?
It's because obviously sellotape has that shine crinkle being the operative word. It makes noises. I personally don't find that sellotape lasts that long. It does tend to break quicker. Obviously, different tapes wear at different rates. But I think sellotape is a very unforgiving tape to use because once it's down, it's down. And there are other tapes out there that are a little bit more forgiving. So if you put it down and it's slightly wrong and it's going to not join the two pieces of paper all the way up, you can sort of gently peel it back and it doesn't take the paper with it. So it gives you a little bit more margin for error. So I tend to use a sort of a Scotch tape. But also masking tapes are really good for scores because they have really nice, that matte feeling to them. But some people go all the way up and use proper bookbinding tape, which is very expensive. So if you're on a budget, don't skip that. But if you really fancy like treating yourself, get yourself some bookbinding tape.
Do you have a favorite brand that's affordable? Like you said Scotch tape, but not just plain clear Scotch tape, right? You're talking about something else.
Scotch Magic tape. I tend to use that quite a lot. It's got a nice soft feeling to it. So I like to have it all the way along the edge and tucked top and bottom, because I find that if you tuck the tape, the top and the bottom, the pages are much less likely to sort of pull apart from each other, because you can obviously rip down the seam if you really, really try. But I find if you tuck top and bottom, it's that little bit harder because then you don't have the flap of the page just to catch on something and set it off. But yeah, it's got a nice soft feeling. It kind of has a static to it, so you don't have to press it down. It kind of finds its way down to the paper for you, and so then you're less likely to stretch it and then crinkle the paper because the tape has been stretched. So when it pulls back, it pulls the paper with it. If you let it sort of just lie flat, it just whoosh, straight down.
Okay, so last time I taped parts, I ended up taping both sides of the seam. But I was trying to be actually mindful of which direction the paper was going to fold. How do you deal with that? Like, do you tape the inside of the fold, the outside, or both sides? What do you do? Well,
now it depends on how long the part is. So in this hypothetical scenario, let's say the part is 3 pages. What I do is I print... So I'm going to use British sizes here.
That's fine.
I am British. What can I say? I print for a 3-page part. I print the first page. Well, for a 3-page part for a recording session, which is all single-sided because that's just how we do it. I print the first page on A4 on its own, and then pages 2 to 3, I print 2 up on a piece of A3.
So for Americans, that'd be the equivalent of like letter and then tabloid. Because A3 is twice as big as A4 in the opposite dimension, right?
Exactly. It's 2 A4s sat side by side.
Right. Like tabloid to letter.
Yeah. So I've got 1 and then 2 and 3. So I tape. So with all of the pages face up looking at me, so I can look down at my table and see 1, 2, 3, and have a little double check of the last bar number of page 1 and the first bar number of page 2, and be absolutely certain that these pages should go together, because we've all been there, taped the wrong pages together. And I like to have that was the best tip I got from the first composer and copyist I worked with, Jessica Danheiser, who is brilliant. She's always about the face up, because then you're seeing what you're doing. It's right there. You can double check the entire time. And then I tape, page 1 to page 2 on the front, and then you fold 2 to 3 into each other so they look at each other. So then you've got the seam on the back that would be sticky is just a fold of paper.
Got it. That makes sense.
It does.
You're trying to think about how it's going to lay out on the stand, and you're going to tape according to that.
Yeah, well, I tend to make sure that the default way that you would hand it over to the player mostly, because obviously if the player wants to spin it around, they spin it around, and you can't tape the front and the back for everything because A, it will take too long, and B, you use an awful lot of tape. As long as everything's together and everything's clear, when you hand it to them, you've got the first page of each part is always face up and out. So as you're flicking through, you can always see what the cue numbers are, and everything about it. And as long as when I give it to them, everything's correct, face up, face out. And as you're looking at the parts on the left edge, none of it's sticky. There aren't sticky edges on either side. So everything's nice and smooth and clean. And I hand it to them. So, because obviously if you leave tape sticky on the outside, sometimes the parts can stick together and then the player will go, oh, I don't have it. They do have it, but it's stuck to something else, or it'll stick to something else and get lost somewhere. So no sticky on the outside.
Got it. Okay, so we've got weight, we've got the sound of the paper, we've got binding. Anything else?
Having a think about the layout, obviously, of the parts. Now, that's a whole thing. And there's all sorts of arguments about staff sizes and what's appropriate for different contexts. Someone told me, I think it was a Viennese orchestra, was surveyed about how big they wanted their staves and their parts. And they ended up voting for over 9 points.
Are you serious? That's huge.
Which I find kind of patronizing because it's that sort of child picture book size.
Right, yeah.
And to my mind, I think there is such a thing. I mean, I don't play in orchestras regularly, so I might be completely wrong. But when I look at a part that I've printed that's sort of edging towards 8 point, and sometimes even 7.5, it almost looks too big on the page. And I struggle to focus on any one system because I'm constantly looking at the one above or below because they're all sort of in focus. But I find that for me, when I've printed a 7 point part on A4 paper, it just looks right. Now, whether that's just what I've become used to, but that's what I tend to go for. But you might want to consider, if you're being very, very nice, which instruments tend to be a little bit further from the stand. So trombones, double basses, the ones that have that bit of distance between their actual person and the stand, because the instrument's in the middle, might want it bumped up a little bit.
Okay. So would you do like a 7 and 7.5 then?
Yeah, about that. I think a lot of some copies have 7.5 as the minimum, or even slightly higher, which is fine. I think it's kind of easy to forget how capable professional. Like, obviously, we're talking a lot of the time about top level professional musicians are. They can read almost anything, and copies go to such lengths to make everything perfect for these sessions with the correct paper and the binding and the staff size. And I mean, you could almost scribble something on the back of a napkin and give it to a lot of these players, and they would play it perfectly. But that doesn't mean you should slack off. But I think it's fun that we all care so much about all of these little details of this sort of weird language that we've all developed with just lines and dots. We're like, yes, it must be this big. It must be on this paper.
Huh.
I love it.
I love being able to pick your mind about this because I personally don't get the opportunity to ask these kinds of detailed questions to a professional copyist. And I want my music, when I hand it to a musician, I want them to feel good about playing it. And that kind of physical, nonverbal sense you get from looking at and handling the music is something that I want to be able to do for them. And it's intangible, but I think it's these little things.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. There is, and I think from sort of the copy's perspective, and I'm sure you feel this when you hand it over, when you know you've done a good job, and you look down at the part and you go, yeah, that's correctly widely spaced. Oh, those multi-rests are great. Oh, the top and the bottom is all, the line, it's all in alignment, and you just, it looks great. And you're like, that is a nice thing to look at there. It's great.
I'm convinced that kind of thing you're describing can make the difference between a successful sight read and a not successful one. Because the musicians performing it are perceiving the conflicts on the layout.
Yes.
I don't have the right words for this right now. But do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. And it is amazing. And so this is one of the great things about my role at Dorico, which is writing the user manual. I have to explain a lot of these things that for years I never had to even think about. And you have to, well, what is a slur? Well, and please describe a slur in 2 sentences in very accessible language. Go. Right, okay. But slurs are deep in my soul. They are. You can't explain a slur. It's a slur. I mean, so these are the fantastic challenges I've been through to try and explain some of these sort of musical notation concepts in the manual. But it kind of it has, and through doing that and through talking to Daniel, who is just a fountain of knowledge. I mean, goodness, if he were to do like a university course, I mean, that would be something, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah.
I hope he doesn't mind me saying that. You start to appreciate the things that you would never notice, like when note spacing is wider than X, the eye gets upset, or when note spacing is narrower than X, the eye gets upset. And the distance between ledger lines must be at least this, otherwise it looks like they're all blurring into one. And where that micro fine line is, it's amazing. But obviously that's what the Dorico team do. They analyze all this stuff to make sure that they're coding it into the software, which is a whole other thing, because obviously it's almost coming full circle. Well, I get to see it coming full circle through all the amazing work they do, which is all of these rules that got codified through handwriting, through sort of printing press typesetting, into modern notation softwares, and now into the softwares of the future. These sort of almost intangible rules.
Well, honestly, I'm glad that there's people like you and the software engineers doing that, because I just want to write the music and then make it. I don't want to take the time to have to do all the spacing myself.
Well, that's what copyists are for.
Yeah, you're right. So I should just hire you.
And publishers.
Yeah. So I have a funny story about slurs. When I was in undergrad, this was like late 90s, and I was using my first software notation. I think it was made by Cakewalk. So this is a long time ago, Sonar.
Wow.
I made a score and I showed it to a professor, and she said, "Your slurs look like eyelashes fell onto the page." Like, just little thin lines that just kind of sit there. And she was right. And now I look at the music that I'm making, and like the arc of the slur is literally beautiful. It's gorgeous.
It's funny that you remember comments like that. That must have really stuck out.
Well, it did, because I thought I was making something that was amazing, and I just got shut down. It was a learning experience.
Right. We all have to learn, and the best way to learn is to do it.
Yeah.
And do it wrong.
Absolutely.
And then do it again.
and keep doing it. That's right.
Absolutely.
So obviously, if you haven't figured it out yet, and if you've been listening to the podcast, you should have heard it because the podcast opens with it. But I am sponsored by Dorico, and Lillie and I are not speaking because of that. It's because she's a composer in her own right, and she does this professionally, this engraving stuff. But
what? I have another life? Who's what?
Right?
Right.
But you do. But I am so happy with Dorico. As a composer, it does everything I want it to do, and my scores look great, and my players don't complain about the parts. Obviously, you have to go in and finesse where a page turn might be or something, but it just looks good.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And that's from my personal perspective as a composer, because I use it myself. And I remember the first thing I did in Dorico was Christmas 2017. I was asked to play a couple of Christmas carols at a friend's wedding that was happening in December. And I found some arrangements, and one of them was engraved, I think it's fair to say, but I don't think it's fair to say much more than that. And I was looking at this thing because I printed it out, and I was looking at it, and I just was, no, there's a better way. I'm gonna type this up into Dorico, and it was just magnificent. It was gorgeous, and I think I put in one system break to make sure there were the right number of systems on, or like same number of bars on all the systems. But that was it, and I didn't touch it otherwise. And I printed it out, and it was on my piano when a friend came round, and she was like, "Oh, is that Dorico?" I was like, "Yes." How would you feel if I told you I basically did nothing to that? And she was like, a little bit sick, to be honest.
Right? Yes. Yeah, people don't believe me when I show them my score and my parts. Like, I really didn't do anything.
It's nice. And so in a way, that's kind of the stuff that we were talking about. How do you make sure that when the player looks at your music, they have a positive first impression, that it looks like you care? Because I think I don't want to speak for players, but my worry is personally that someone will look at the part that I've made for them and think, well, my number one worry is always that they'll think this music is terrible.
Well, every composer has that. Right.
Thank you. Yeah. But my second fear is that they'll think, God, did she even try? What? Why should I play this if she hasn't tried to make my part nice? So I'm like, it must be the most perfect part ever. I must make friends and influence people with this part. And yeah, so it's all the stuff we were talking about, making sure it looks nice, making sure the page turns work, making sure it reads, making sure that the flow of the music is clear from the spacing of the part, all of this stuff. It does make a difference in it. I like to hope that it does, because we care about it.
Well, I'm convinced it does. And there's a reason why certain publishers have a reputation, right? You can look at a Baron Writer score, or you can look at a Boozy score, and they look a certain way, and they generally look great. And then you can go to IMSLP, and you can look at a scan from 120 years ago, and it doesn't really look that good anymore.
Yep. Oh, and or sometimes you find a scan and it's of the lovely hand engraved part, and you go, "Oh, it's gorgeous."
Yes. Well, if it was really, really engraved, yeah. Can we continue focusing on the copyist stuff? I know that your world is rich and you have so much to contribute, but I just have so many questions.
Please ask the questions. I love it.
I am always advocating to myself and to others to outsource work, so that from my perspective, it's so that I can continue doing the high level things. And when I'm writing music, the highest level production I can do is literally writing the music, and the engraving and copying can take time. And I just saw a Facebook post yesterday. A composer friend was saying, well, what do you guys outsource? And so many of the comments were saying, well, I'd like to outsource my copying and engraving, but I just cost too much, or I don't have the budget. As a copyist yourself, how do you respond to that? And how would you advocate? Why should composers outsource this work?
I think the first point I would say is it's about sort of production line efficiency. Whenever you do something that you don't do all the time, it takes you longer. So every time I want to cook a meal that I've not cooked for ages, I have to go back to the recipe book to check what ingredients I need, because I can't remember what goes into it. B, then possibly go and get the things in relatively small batches, because I'm not going to make it out often. And then you have to cook it, but it takes longer to cook it because you're constantly referring back to the instructions. And so the whole process takes you that bit longer because you're not in the swing of it. But if I were to say, oh, I want to have this particular meal, I know my friend makes it every day, can you come round and make this meal? They'll come round, they'll have all the stuff, they'll do it in half the time that it took you, and you don't have the worry and the pressure of doing it yourself, because you always get caught in a corner somewhere that you weren't expecting. It's like, oh, I forgot there was that thing, and oh, I've just printed that part, but there's a mistake on it. Right, do it again. And those little stresses, and obviously budgets are always a concern, and you have to be financially responsible. But I think if you're in a position where you can start to weigh those things up, I think, someone who does copying all the time, who has a rigorous system for naming structures, who has house styles coming out of their ears that will do half of the stuff that it would take you 2 hours to do in like 3 seconds, you then start to become a part of a production line. And there's a reason that in sort of, film music world, where turnaround times are very short, there are quite a number of roles between the composer and the music stand, and copying is just one of them.
Right. But there's this sense in the contemporary concert world, in new music, that if you don't do it yourself, it's not worth it. Or there's a sense of shame that I've picked up from composers who send towards others, who allow someone to do their copying and engraving.
Well, that's quite sad. I mean, I do understand it from the sort of contemporary classical world, because a lot of the time composers will be developing ways of notating that are completely unique to them. And so I would imagine the fear is, will this person even understand what I'm trying to do, or will they completely change my very intricate notation and make it different? And so if that's the concern, you probably want to if you find yourself needing to, reduce the load off your plate, and you do need to pass on to a copyist just to make your life bearable, because hey, work-life balance, heard of it? I haven't. You might want to develop quite a close relationship with an individual, someone that you know, someone that you can trust, someone that you have a working relationship with, and start to build up that thing where you almost could write in shorthand what you wanted, and they would know exactly what you meant because they've worked with you before, they've seen it before, they know what you mean, you speak the same language. I think if that's the concern, there's a very clear answer to that, which is friends. Make friends.
Right.
And I think if the feeling is that you have to do it all yourself, then I'm not sure I agree with that, because you don't have to do everything. That there are infinite musical professions within the music world for a reason, because there are lots and lots of different skills. And if you feel pressured to do your own engraving or your own copying because you feel that you should, even if you maybe don't even enjoy it, it's not your forte, and you really would rather just be writing, I don't think there's any shame in that at all.
Yeah. Well, I think the budget issue is the biggest hurdle for people to overcome. Yeah. I don't know how you structure your pricing, but I've seen copyists structure it by bar or by stave or some combination of the two. But in general, so like let's say for a choral work, so SATB with piano, we're talking 6 staves, that's 4 or 5 minutes long. What would someone expect to pay for that, to get that engraved nicely?
I mean, how long
is that too complex to answer right now?
It's quite complex. I mean,
Okay.
And I guess it varies from individual to individual, and it can vary from project to project. I guess it kind of depends on how like you're saying, depending on how they work out the costs of it. I personally tend to go by hour of time of work rather than by bar or things like that. And there are all sorts of, well, particularly in the UK, there's the Musicians Union who recommend sort of minimum rates depending on what you're charging. And so I think my advice would be to look up those minimum rates, and if to sort of maybe look at the bar rates or the stave rates or the minute rates, and look at what you wanted done, and maybe get an idea of what it could be from that. And then you could approach copyists and ask if this is what they would agree. Because obviously, if depending on what's included, if you are going by time, the complexity of the notation will affect that. Because if it's pretty standard sort of hymnal stuff, mostly rhythmic unison, there's not going to be too much notational difficulty in there, so it will probably just be a case of tidying up, and it wouldn't take that long at all. But if it's more modern, and if there's lots of unusual techniques, if there's lots of like glissando lines that could jump around various places, those sorts of things just take that a little bit longer. And again, if you're quite precise about what you wanted done, and there was quite a lot of back and forth with the copyist of, actually, could you do this? Actually, could you do that? That will increase the amount of time they're spending on it and how much they're going to charge. It's really hard to say.
Yeah, I imagine. That was a rough question. Sorry. You did great, though. Blame me.
I hope that was useful. I think the big takeaway from that is to look at the Musicians Union rates. They've got all sorts of PDFs for different things. So obviously, they have minimum rates for recording musicians, so to what to pay players for different uses, which is very important to know about. But then ones for copyists and arrangers and orchestrators is very useful as well. It can give you a real good idea of what it might cost.
Yeah. Well, Lillie, we're approaching about an hour, and I want to be respectful of your time, and I have to take my daughter to her lesson, so I need to wrap it up too. But is there anything else that you'd like to say that I forgot to ask you about today?
I don't think so. It's been lovely to chat to somebody who's interested in copying.
Well, I think
there's always more.
There's always more. Oh my gosh, we could talk for hours, I'm sure. And now I'm like, can you look at my scores and tell me what I did wrong? But I'm not going to do that to you without paying you for your time.
Well,
absolutely.
I mean, if you want to, throw them over.
All right, we will talk again sometimes in the future because there's a wealth of information here that I think is very valuable. And any composer that's producing a score or parts has to know this stuff. If you're not outsourcing it, you've got to be able to make something that's readable and performable.
Absolutely. I'd love to come back because obviously there's more stuff about part preparation and decisions that could be talked about.
Why don't you write a manual about this or something?
Oh, wait.
That was bad. All right.
No, well, actually, I mean, just not to want to plug it, but there are some handy hints and tips that I have slotted into the engrave mode section of the Dorico manual, in partly through discussion with Daniel about what sorts of things people want to know, but there are some useful things amongst the sort of technical usage that might be helpful.
Well, to be honest, I have found that to be true too. So I imagine as I've looked through the manuals online, trying to solve a problem, I learned something. It's like, oh, that'll improve stuff in the future. I need to remember that. So thank you for writing those things.
Thank you for saying that. It's nice to hear that it's useful. Very good.
Yeah, I absolutely. All right, Lillie, have a fantastic rest of your evening, and I'll talk to you later.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
This episode of The Portfolio Composer has been supported by Dorico, the music notation software from Steinberg. Whether you're a composer or arranger, a teacher or student, working in music engraving and publishing, or working in producing music for media such as film, TV, and games, Dorico is the tool for you. Dorico comes in 2 versions, Dorico Pro for professionals and Dorico Elements, providing the perfect introduction to the world of scoring. Whichever version you choose, you'll be using software packed full of smart features that produces beautiful results completely automatically, allowing you to get music on the stand more quickly than with any other software. You can bring music into Dorico from your existing software using Music XML or MIDI, and you can try Dorico out completely free of charge for 30 days by downloading a trial version from dorico.com/TPC. Try it today.